Welcome to today's deep dive. We're looking at the March 10th, 2026 editions of the Business Standard and Economic Times today. And the picture emerging from these pages is honestly one of intense, almost whiplash-inducing contrasts.
It really is.
Yeah, so we're going to take this massive stack of developments and try to cut straight to the core of what is actually happening. Because on one side of the ledger, you have a global economy reacting to a massive geopolitical shock in West Asia, and yet operating on an entirely different frequency.
Almost entirely insulated, it seems.
Right, exactly. We have these major structural moves happening within Indian corporations that suggest a timeline built on long-term domestic optimism.
It is a profound divergence. I mean, when you have global headlines dominating the screens, tankers halting, international conflicts escalating, it creates this massive wall of noise. And the immediate reaction for anyone managing a portfolio or a business is to play defensive.
To just hit the panic button.
Exactly. But when you filter out that panic and look closely at the corporate filings, the domestic capital flows, and the regulatory shifts happening simultaneously, a much more complex reality takes shape. We are going to unpack the mechanics of both those realities today. And just to set the ground rules here, a lot of the sources today deal with politically charged events.
Wars, state policies, the works.
Right. But our focus is strictly on reporting the facts and analyzing the economic and investment implications impartially. We are not taking political sides, just looking at the math.
And for you listening, that is exactly the mission for this deep dive. We are going to break down the sheer volume of information from today's business news, skip the superficial panic, and connect the dots. We'll look at the math behind the oil shock, the reality of the domestic consumer market, the massive repatriation of tech giants, and what this all actually means for the deployment of capital.
Let's start with the macro shockwave.
Yeah, we have to, because you can't contextualize anything else today without understanding the sheer scale of the disruption in the energy markets. The number everyone is staring at right now is Brent crude oil pushing past $119 per barrel.
To be precise, it hit an intraday high of $119 in the futures market.
And nearly $117 in the spot market.
Yeah, before it came back down to settle around $103. That spread between the futures and the spot market and just the intense volatility of those swings, it tells you everything about the geopolitical premium currently being priced into the market.
It's not about supply and demand.
No, not at all. This isn't a supply-demand imbalance driven by pure economics. This is driven by the escalating U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran. Major producers are actively cutting supplies, and the critical logistical artery—
Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively shut down.
I think we need to pause and visualize the Strait of Hormuz for a second for everyone listening, because hearing shut down sounds a bit abstract until you look at the map. You have this incredibly narrow waterway between Oman and Iran. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only a couple of miles wide.
It is a tiny bottleneck.
A tiny bottleneck, and roughly 1/5 of the world's total global oil supply has to pass through it. When tankers stop moving through there, it is an instant cardiovascular event for the global energy market.
And the political signals suggest this isn't some temporary blockade that just resolves over a long weekend. Iran has named Mojtaba Khamenei, the hardline son of the assassinated Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as the new supreme leader.
Which is a huge signal.
The geopolitical consensus reading that move is that it signals an absolute refusal to retreat. The posture in Tehran is not backing down, which means the market has to price in the possibility of a prolonged closure of that strait.
Which brings us to the immediate collateral damage in the financial markets. The Indian equity markets sank to 10-month lows. We saw the Sensex drop 1,353 points today.
Closing at 77,566.
Right. The Nifty fell 422 points to 24,028. And the India VIX, the volatility index that essentially measures the market's expectation of near-term turbulence.
The fear gauge.
The fear gauge, exactly. It spiked to 23.36. In total, 8.5 trillion rupees of BSE market capitalization was wiped out.
It is a violent repricing of risk. And India is uniquely exposed here because of its heavy reliance on imported crude. A sustained shock to oil prices directly threatens to widen the current account deficit.
Because we have to pay more for the same amount of oil.
Exactly. It means more dollars have to flow out of the country just to keep the lights on and the trucks moving. This is fundamentally why we saw the Indian Rupee hit a fresh record low of 92.33 against the U.S. dollar today.
But the internal mechanics of that market sell-off, reveal something really fascinating about who holds the power in Indian equities right now. Because the foreign portfolio investors, the FPIs, they absolutely hit the panic button.
They did. They sold off equities worth 6,346 crore rupees.
But they didn't crash the market as much as they historically would have.
Because of the domestic flows?
Exactly. Domestic institutional investors, the DIIs, absorbed an enormous amount of that shock. They bought up 9,014 crore rupees worth of equities. It is a real-time stress test of the domestic mutual fund and SIP flows acting as a shock absorber against global capital flight.
It is a critical buffer, sure, but it doesn't solve the underlying macroeconomic threat. When we look at the historical comparisons being drawn in the papers today, we are looking at oil being utilized as a geopolitical weapon in a way we haven't seen since the energy crises of the 1970s.
There is this pervasive narrative that the transition to clean energy, all the massive capital deployed into solar, wind, and EVs, has somehow insulated the global economy from these kinds of oil shocks.
But the numbers tell a completely different story. Oil still accounts for 30% of total global energy demand. The sheer volume of oil consumed globally today is almost double what it was in the early 70s.
Double.
Right.
So the transition to renewables is happening, but it is layered on top of, rather than replacing, the existing fossil fuel infrastructure.
The physical supply chains of the world, the cargo ships, the freight trucks, the petrochemicals used in manufacturing, they are all still completely tethered to crude.
Which is why we saw Sebi chairman Tuhin Pandey explicitly address the market turbulence today. He was speaking at the NSE's 30-year Nifty 50 celebration, and he advised investors to, quote, remain calm amidst this storm, pointing to the underlying strength of India's domestic fundamentals.
It is the classic central banker and regulator playbook. You project stability when the external variables are highly unstable.
But let's look at what happens when that abstract barrel of crude oil at $103 actually enters the Indian economy. Because the impact isn't just on trading screens. It hits the refinery, the fuel pump, and the kitchen.
This is where we see the massive collision between international commodity markets and domestic policy. Despite crude pushing past that $100 threshold, the government has signaled that a hike in retail petrol and diesel prices is unlikely in the foreseeable future.
Which is an incredible claim when you look at the math.
It really is.
If the raw material costs skyrocket and the final retail price is artificially capped, that margin compression has to be absorbed by someone. And in this case, it is the state-run oil marketing companies.
The OMCs like HPCL, BPCL, and IOC.
Right. The government's position is that these companies are financially well-positioned to eat those losses for the near term.
The equity markets clearly do not share that confidence. We saw OMC stocks plunge by up to 8% today. Investors are looking at the spread between wholesale crude and capped retail fuel and seeing a scenario where these companies just bleed cash. If they are forced to subsidize the Indian consumer's fuel costs during a prolonged geopolitical crisis, their profitability evaporates.
And the disruption goes so much further beyond just petrol and diesel. We are watching a severe supply chain crisis unfold with LPG right now. India imports about 85% of its LPG, primarily from the West Asian countries.
And most of those shipments travel directly through the disrupted shipping lanes we just discussed.
Exactly. So to prevent a catastrophic shortage of domestic cooking gas, the government has enacted emergency measures. They have directed all domestic refineries to utilize their entire C3 and C4 streams exclusively to maximize LPG production.
Let's unpack the chemistry and economics of that for a second. When a refinery processes crude oil, it separates it into various components. The C3 and C4 streams refer to propane and butane, which are the exact hydrocarbons used to make LPG. So, by mandating that every drop of these specific streams goes into domestic cooking cylinders, the government is prioritizing the household kitchen over every other industrial use.
They literally stated in the reports today, we are in a war situation. Commercial LPG users may be impacted. And when you divert all that supply to households, you basically starve the commercial sector. The National Restaurant Association of India, the NRAI, is sounding the alarm. Commercial LPG supply to hotels and restaurants is being choked off.
We're talking about an industry that employs over 8 million people and generates a turnover of nearly 5.7 trillion rupees. If restaurants cannot secure the gas to operate their kitchens,
They shut down.
And the ripple effects of this hydrocarbon reallocation touch sectors you wouldn't immediately expect. The auto industry is bracing for production disruptions because they rely on industrial gases derived from those same petroleum byproducts.
We even saw agrochemical and fertilizer stocks.
Mm.
Companies like GNFC and GSFC fall by up to 5% today.
Because fertilizers require petrochemical inputs. When those inputs become scarce or prohibitively expensive, it disrupts the entire agricultural supply chain.
And that agricultural disruption is compounding an already precarious situation. We're looking at a strong El Niño potentially disrupting the upcoming Kharif crop season. If you combine weather-driven yield reductions with skyrocketing fertilizer costs, you are looking at a massive spike in food inflation.
This creates an incredibly complex dilemma for the Reserve Bank of India. Before this crisis in West Asia accelerated, the prevailing consensus was that India was entering a Goldilocks phase.
Right. Growth was robust, inflation was tracking toward the target band.
Exactly. And the Monetary Policy Committee was widely expected to maintain a lower for longer stance on interest rates, currently sitting at 5.25%.
Because you don't want to hike rates and stifle corporate borrowing when the economy is expanding.
But if this oil shock translates into sustained structural inflation hitting transport logistics, food production, and raw materials, the RBI might be backed into a corner where they have to raise rates just to defend the currency and cool down prices.
Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman actually addressed this in Parliament today. She stated that the impact of rising global crude on inflation is not estimated to be substantial at this immediate moment. The rationale is that India currently has an inflation buffer, as recent prints have been near the lower bound of their target.
But she added the crucial caveat, a prolonged conflict alters the calculus entirely.
And the logistics of a prolonged conflict are already causing panic among exporters. Buffalo meat exporters are actively recalling consignments that were destined for West Asia.
They are pulling them back because there simply isn't adequate cold storage capacity at the ports to hold perishable goods, while shipping routes are delayed, rerouted, or frozen entirely. The meat will literally spoil on the docks.
At the same time, pharma exporters are lobbying the government for fruit subsidies because the cost of rerouting shipments around the conflict zones is destroying their export margins.
It illustrates the absolute fragility of physical trade. You can have a highly competitive export product, but if the physical maritime choke points are compromised, the economics of the trade collapse instantly.
Which brings us to a sector facing an almost unprecedented confluence of crises. Let's look at the diamond polishing industry in Surat. We are talking about a highly specialized cluster that cuts and polishes roughly 9 out of every 10 diamonds in the world.
Their largest export destination this year is the UAE, accounting for nearly $7.67 billion in trade. So they are immediately threatened by the logistical and economic fallout of the West Asian War.
But on top of that, they are simultaneously dealing with the threat of sweeping U.S. tariffs on luxury goods.
It is a dual shock to both their primary trading hub and their ultimate end consumer market. But what is truly remarkable is how the industry is responding. They aren't just absorbing the blow. They are executing a massive structural pivot.
Right. An estimated 80% of the diamond polishing operations in Surat have now shifted to processing lab-grown diamonds instead of natural mine stones.
That is an astonishing reallocation of skill and capital. Lab-grown diamonds are chemically identical to mined diamonds, but they are produced in a fraction of the time and, crucially, at a much lower cost.
Because their base value is significantly lower, they typically attract lower effective tariffs when exported.
There is a historical precedent for this level of adaptability in Surat that puts this pivot into perspective. During the 1940s, the outbreak of World War II decimated the global demand for semi-precious stones. The artisans in Surat faced an existential threat to their livelihoods.
So what do they do?
To survive, they adapted their highly specialized polishing equipment and techniques to manufacture sniper scope lenses for the military. They shifted from luxury goods to defense manufacturing almost overnight.
That is incredible. And 80 years later, we are seeing the modern equivalent. They are pivoting away from the natural diamond monopoly to lab-grown stones to navigate modern economic warfare, tariff threats, and supply chain blockades.
But the transition on the ground is far from seamless. The working capital cycle for a diamond cutter is incredibly capital intensive. You have to buy the rough stones, finance the labor and machinery to polish them, and float that cost until the finished product is sold and exported.
And with global demand stalling and shipping routes compromised, that working capital has just dried up. The industry veterans are advising smaller cutting units to make a brutal financial decision right now. They're saying, Liquidate your existing inventory of natural stones at a 10% loss, simply to generate the cash flow needed to keep the lights on, and pivot to lab-grown processing.
Taking a definitive loss just to maintain liquidity is the ultimate sign of distress. But it also shows a clear-eyed understanding of the structural shift. The natural diamond monopoly is being fractured by the sheer necessity of survival.
Now, we've spent the first half of this deep dive looking at companies and sectors that are scrambling to mitigate the immediate acute shocks of this geopolitical crisis.
Yeah.
But as we established at the beginning, there is a completely different narrative playing out in parallel.
Right, the domestic optimism.
Yes. We are seeing major Indian corporations executing massive multi-year strategic moves that seem entirely unbothered by the chaos in the global commodity markets.
Most significant of these moves is happening with Flipkart. The Walmart-owned e-commerce giant has officially completed the process of moving its holding company domicile from Singapore back to India.
This is a monumental structural shift that has been 15 years in the making. To understand why this is such a big deal, we have to look back to why they left in the first place.
The flip.
Right, the initial flip. Around 2011, many Indian tech startups, including Flipkart, moved their holding entities to places like Singapore or the US. They did this to access a more favorable regulatory environment, easier avenues for raising foreign venture capital, and clearer tax structures for intellectual property.
So the fact that a behemoth like Flipkart is executing a reverse flip to come back to India fundamentally redefines how the domestic regulatory and capital markets are perceived today.
The mechanics of bringing a company of that valuation back onshore are incredibly complex. It isn't just filing a change of address. Flipkart had to secure a specific clearance from the Indian government known as a Press Note 3 nod.
This regulation requires government approval for any foreign direct investment originating from countries that share a land border with India.
Right, and Flipkart needed this because Tencent, the Chinese technology conglomerate, holds a 5 to 6% stake in the company. Navigating that regulatory hurdle proves that the pathway for these massive repatriations is viable.
And the strategic endgame for Flipkart is clear. This domicile shift is the prerequisite for a domestic initial public offering. They are targeting a massive public listing on the Indian exchanges for 2026 or 2027.
It signals a profound confidence in the depth and maturity of the Indian capital markets. We saw PhonePen execute a similar reverse flip recently, absorbing massive tax liabilities to do so. These companies are doing the math and realizing that they no longer need to list in New York or Singapore to achieve premium valuations.
The liquidity available right here in the domestic market is sufficient to absorb these mega IPOs.
The numbers back that up completely.
Right.
Over the last 2 years, the domestic IPO market has facilitated $43 billion in fundraising. Furthermore, an additional $100 billion has been raised through block sales and private placements. The sheer volume of domestic capital looking for high-quality equity is staggering.
However, the market is entering a new phase of maturity. The initial euphoria of the post-pandemic tech listings has settled into a more disciplined environment for capital allocation. Investors are becoming highly selective.
Companies are being explicitly warned by investment bankers to temper their valuation expectations, or they risk their IPOs failing to garner subscriptions.
It is a healthy normalization of the market.
And Flipkart isn't the only one preparing to tap this liquidity. We are seeing major restructuring across various sectors in preparation for public markets. Cars24, the major used car platform, just saw its CEO Himanshu Ratnú step down as part of a leadership transition explicitly aimed at readying the company for a potential IPO.
Edelweiss Financial Services sold a 4.4% stake in its asset management arm for 375 crore rupees, establishing a benchmark valuation ahead of their planned 1,500 crore rupee IPO.
Even established conglomerates are utilizing this period to consolidate their domestic footprint. Reliance Retail made a strategic acquisition of the beauty and wellness brand Pahadi Local, with the intention of scaling it aggressively through their massive omni-channel network.
These are long-term capital allocation decisions predicated on the continuous growth of the Indian domestic consumer, completely looking past the immediate volatility in crude prices or global shipping.
That domestic focus brings us to a fascinating intersection of state politics, banking infrastructure, and employment. When we look at the banking sector today, the major pressure didn't come from global macroeconomics. It came from domestic policy.
We saw bank stocks, major players like Union Bank, Federal Bank, and State Bank of India take a sharp hit today.
The catalyst was a massive farm loan waiver announced by the Maharashtra government.
The scale of the waiver is significant. The state government is waiving agricultural loans up to 2 lakh rupees per farmer. This program is projected to benefit roughly 5 million farmers, but it will cost the state exchequer an estimated 10,000 crore rupees.
Let's unpack the mechanics of why a state government paying off loans causes bank stocks to plunge. On the surface, if a farmer is facing acute distress, say their Kharif crop failed due to the El Nino weather patterns, and their input costs skyrocketed because of the fertilizer supply chain issues we discussed earlier, this waiver provides immediate, vital humanitarian and political relief.
The state is literally handing the bank the money the farmer owed, so why does the market hate it?
Because it fundamentally fractures the credit culture of the banking system. When a government announces a loan waiver, or even when the political rhetoric suggests a waiver is coming, human behavior changes.
Borrowers who have the financial capacity to repay their loans simply stop making their scheduled payments. They strategically default, anticipating that their debt will be absorbed by the next government program.
It trains the borrower to view debt as a negotiable political instrument rather than a strict financial obligation.
Precisely. And while the state government covers the cost of this specific tranche of waived loans, the banks are left dealing with a massive spike in non-performing assets from all the other borrowers who have suddenly stopped paying.
It takes years for a bank to rebuild the discipline of lending and borrowing in a region after a major waiver.
It represents a persistent, systemic risk to the short-term asset quality of these lenders.
While the banks are dealing with the fallout of state-level populism, the Reserve Bank of India is actively trying to engineer better governance at the national level for non-banking financial companies, the NBFCs. The RBI is reportedly considering the implementation of a strict leadership rotation rule for massive institutions like LIC Housing Finance and Shriram Finance.
The proposed rule would cap the tenure of an NBFC promoter or chief executive officer at a maximum of 10 or 15 years. The regulatory objective here is clear: to enhance corporate governance and aggressively mitigate the risk of institutional fraud.
Because when power and decision-making authority remain concentrated in the hands of a single individual or a small group for decades, it creates blind spots in oversight.
And increases the probability of systemic risk building up unnoticed.
It forces successions. It ensures that fresh eyes regularly review the loan books and operational practices of these massive financial institutions. But from an operational standpoint, it introduces a significant variable: execution risk.
You could have a highly competent CEO who has successfully navigated multiple economic cycles, and you are forcing them out purely based on a regulatory stopwatch. You're trading the stability of proven leadership for the structural safety of forced governance.
It is a very delicate balance for the regulator. You want institutional memory, but you don't want institutional complacency. Now, let's look at another complex metric that is sending mixed signals about the broader economy: the employment data. We have this fascinating paradox emerging from the National Career Service, the NCS portal.
The data shows that the number of active job vacancies posted on the portal fell to a 16-month low of 1.5 million in February.
But simultaneously, the number of active employers registering on the portal surged to a 5-month high of 153,000.
You have more companies participating in the system than in recent months, but they are offering fewer actual jobs. Economists analyzing this specific divergence view it as a real-time indicator of corporate hesitation.
The increase in employer registrations suggests a structural digitization of the HR and recruitment processes. Companies are modernizing their administrative functions and integrating with national portals.
They are getting their paperwork in order, setting up their accounts, essentially building the runway for future hiring. But when it comes time to actually extend an offer, increase the headcount, and take on the fixed cost of a new employee, they are pulling back.
They're looking at the inflation risks, the geopolitical volatility, and deciding to maintain their current operational capacity rather than expanding.
However, if we look at how these companies are managing their balance sheets, there is a very strong signal that this hesitation is temporary. The projections for external commercial borrowings, or ECBs, are highly optimistic. Volumes are expected to grow by 25 to 30%, potentially reaching $65 billion in the financial year 2027.
External commercial borrowings are essentially Indian corporations raising capital from foreign lenders, often in foreign currencies, to fund their operations or expansions. If they are scaling back on hiring today, why are they preparing to borrow $65 billion?
Because capital expenditure cycles require massive lead times. You don't raise $1 billion overnight to build a new manufacturing facility or upgrade your infrastructure. Strong ECB growth indicates that corporate India is quietly but aggressively lining up the financing required for massive capacity expansion in the coming years.
They are securing the capital now, looking past the immediate quarter's volatility to ensure they are fully funded when the macro environment stabilizes and they are ready to deploy.
It is a very sophisticated approach to capital allocation. Digitize the processes now, secure the cheap long-term funding now, and deploy when the risk premium drops.
And just a quick illustrative note on banking regulations before we move on. The Finance Ministry issued a specific clarification today regarding Yan-Dan accounts. These are the basic savings bank deposit accounts created under the National Financial Inclusion Mission.
The ministry confirmed that there are absolutely no fines or penal charges levied on these accounts if the depositor fails to maintain a minimum balance.
Amidst all this complex corporate finance, the core regulatory protection for the most vulnerable retail depositors remains intact.
It is a vital assurance. Financial inclusion only works if the cost of participating in the banking system doesn't penalize poverty.
Let's pivot from the traditional financial architecture to the sectors that are actively trying to build the future: technology, AI, pharma, and the semiconductor supply chain. The most provocative story in the tech sector today involves Anthropic, one of the premier artificial intelligence companies. They are actively suing the United States Defense Department.
The Pentagon designated Anthropic with a supply chain risk label, and Anthropic is arguing in court that this designation is an unlawful, punitive measure.
The context behind this lawsuit is fascinating. Anthropic has taken a definitive stance on how its technology can be deployed, specifically refusing to allow its AI models to be utilized for mass surveillance programs or integrated into fully autonomous weapons systems.
The lawsuit alleges that the Pentagon is essentially punishing them commercially for drawing an ethical and operational line in the sand regarding military applications.
It is a profound legal battle over who controls the deployment of foundational AI. But while they are fighting the Pentagon over military use, their commercial integration is accelerating massively.
Microsoft has officially attacked Anthropic to power its new Copilot Co-work feature, signaling deep integration into enterprise software.
And the capital continues to flood into the underlying infrastructure required to run these models. An AI infrastructure firm called Ninscale, backed by NVIDIA, just hit a staggering $14.6 billion valuation following a $2 billion funding round as they prepare for a massive IPO.
This relentless scaling of AI infrastructure poses a very specific challenge for the Indian IT services sector. Historically, Indian IT giants built their incredible growth by managing enterprise software, cloud migrations, and digital transformations.
But as the core value shifts toward integrating these massive AI models, the global market is going to demand a measurable return on investment for all this AI expenditure.
India's ability to generate long-term compounding growth in technology services will be rigorously tested. They have to transition from just maintaining systems to building high-value AI-driven applications.
Tech Mahindra, one of those major IT services players, had to step in today to officially deny widespread social media rumors, claiming they were planning a massive layoff of 30,000 employees. They categorized the claims entirely as market rumors, which highlights the intense scrutiny and anxiety currently surrounding employment in the traditional IT sector as the AI transition accelerates.
But while software transitions are complex, the hardware reality is becoming an absolute strategic imperative. The Indian government is closely tracking the global semiconductor supply snags we are seeing, but the solution they're pushing is domestic localization.
We are seeing new assembly units coming online from major conglomerates. The Tata Group has launched CG Semi, CG Power is entering the space, and Wipro is aggressively moving into OSAT.
OSAT is a critical component of the semiconductor supply chain. It stands for Outsourced Semiconductor Assembly and Test.
Right, so Wipro isn't designing the microscopic architecture of the silicon chips, and they aren't fabricating the raw wafers. What OSAT means is that they are taking those finished silicon wafers, cutting them into individual chips, encasing them in the protective packaging you actually see on a circuit board, and running the rigorous testing required before they are integrated into a car or a smartphone.
It is the highly complex final mile of semiconductor manufacturing. By domesticating the OSAT process, India drastically reduces its vulnerability to the exact kind of global supply chain shocks currently impacting the energy and shipping markets.
Moving to the pharmaceutical sector, We saw a massive legal ruling that fundamentally alters the export landscape for Indian drug manufacturers. The Delhi High Court ruled in favor of Dr. Reddy's laboratories, allowing them to manufacture the blockbuster weight loss and diabetes drug semaglutide.
They defeated a legal challenge mounted by the Danish pharmaceutical giant Novo Nordisk, who holds the original patents.
The crucial detail here is the jurisdiction. The court isn't allowing Dr. Reddy's to sell a generic version of semaglutide in markets where Novo Nordisk's patent is still valid and enforced. They are specifically authorizing Dr. Reddy's to manufacture the drug purely for export to non-patented jurisdictions.
It is a massive strategic victory. The global demand for these specific weight management drugs is unprecedented. By legally securing the right to manufacture and export to countries where the patent doesn't apply, Indian generic manufacturers can tap into a highly lucrative, rapidly expanding global revenue stream without violating international intellectual property laws.
And they are actively building the logistical infrastructure to reach those new markets. India and Uzbekistan have officially launched a structured pharma-neutral trade corridor.
This isn't just a bilateral agreement. It is designed to establish Uzbekistan as a strategic base for Indian pharmaceutical companies to expand their access across the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS markets.
It is a clear vector for growth outside of the highly regulated traditional Western markets. We also have a few critical policy and geopolitical updates that round out the macro picture today. In the defense export sector, Indonesia officially sealed a deal to procure BrahMos cruise missiles from India, marking another significant expansion of India's defense manufacturing export footprint in Southeast Asia. In a marketing and sports ecosystem, following India's recent T20 World Cup victory and the subsequent retirement of legends like Virat Kohli and Rohit Sharma from the format, there is a massive scramble underway. Major consumer brands are rushing to lock down endorsement deals with the new, younger generation of cricket stars who are taking over the mantle. And finally, on the domestic policy front, the state of Punjab introduced a sweeping, landmark new Business and Industrial Policy 2026. They are aggressively competing for capital allocation by offering up to 100% fixed capital investment incentives, massive capital subsidies, and they're establishing a new startup hub in Mohali to spur regional economic growth.
It demonstrates that regardless of the macroeconomic headwinds or the geopolitical uncertainties, individual states are fiercely competing to engineer their own microenvironments of growth and attract domestic and foreign direct investment.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, navigating through the volatility of crude oil spikes, the strategic pivots of diamond polishers, the repatriation of tech giants, and the nuances of banking regulations. The mission of this deep dive is to extract the signal from the noise. So looking at everything we've unpacked from today's sources, what are the core developments that a long-term investor or business operator needs to internalize?
If we synthesize this massive news dump, we can distill it into 10 critical developments that will shape long-term capital allocation and strategic planning. Let's look at the massive structural shifts first. Number 1, Flipkart's domicile shift is paramount. The successful execution of this reverse flip signals a rapidly maturing domestic market. It proves the regulatory pathways are viable and paves the way for a massive upcoming IPO opportunity in Indian e-commerce, showing that the liquidity environment in India is now highly attractive to global tech giants.
And that ties directly into number 2, the corporate capex cycle preparation we discussed. Despite the current hesitation in the labor market shown by the NCS portal data, the fact that projected growth in external commercial borrowings is targeting $65 billion tells us that domestic companies are quietly and aggressively lining up massive amounts of capital for future infrastructure and capacity expansion.
Absolutely. They are preparing for growth, but they're doing so in an environment fraught with immediate risks. Which brings us to number 3. The sustained oil price risk. With crude oil testing at the $120 mark intraday, we are looking at a structural threat that widens India's current account deficit, puts immense margin pressure on corporate earnings across multiple sectors, and could easily force the RBI to abandon its anticipated rate cut trajectory to fight inflation.
And the most direct victims of that crude spike are the state-run oil companies, which is development number 4, the OMC margin squeeze. Even with government assurances of price stability for the consumer at the retail pump, companies like HPCL and BPCL face severe, potentially crippling margin compression if global wholesale crude stays elevated, making them highly volatile plays in the near term.
Yet, despite that global volatility, we are seeing number 5, incredible DII resilience versus FPI flight. We witnessed record foreign outflows today driven by the geopolitical panic. However, Domestic institutional flows stepped up massively, absorbing the shock and single-handedly keeping Indian equity markets afloat. It demonstrates a profound structural shift in market dependency away from foreign capital.
We also saw structural shifts forced by necessity, like number 6, the diamond industry's pivot. The rapid transition to lab-grown diamonds, which now represent 80% supply chains of the entire luxury export sector.
Similarly, supply chain vulnerabilities are driving number 7, the push for semiconductor localization. As global chip supplies face constant snags due to geopolitical friction, the critical importance of domestic assembly initiatives, specifically the OSAT facilities being built by groups like Tata and Wipro, becomes a strategic imperative, creating a massive new high-growth sector locally.
And we can't ignore number 8, the pharmaceutical sector's export wins. The legal victory allowing Dr. Reddy's to manufacture blockbuster drugs like semaglutide for non-patented jurisdictions, combined with strategic initiatives like the new trade corridor with Uzbekistan, provide incredibly strong growth vectors for Indian pharma outside of the traditional, highly regulated Western markets.
We also have to monitor the domestic regulatory and political risks to the financial sector. Number 9 is the NBFC governance overhaul being considered by the RBI. Capping leadership tenures at 10 to 15 years will force complex successions at major financial institutions. It improves long-term governance, but introduces significant execution risk and impacts strategic continuity.
And finally, number 10 is the persistent threat of populist state policies, specifically the farm loan waivers impacting banks. Programs like the 10,000 crore rupee waivers in Maharashtra remain a persistent systemic risk. They fundamentally damage banking credit cultures, encourage strategic defaults, and create sudden, sharp shocks to the short-term asset quality of lenders.
Those 10 developments represent the underlying currents that will dictate the flow of capital and economic growth over the next several years, long after today's headlines fade.
It is a phenomenal synthesis of an incredibly chaotic news cycle. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you digest all of this information. We spent a lot of time today talking about the rapid acceleration of artificial intelligence, massive server farms, and the digitalization of the global economy. Yet simultaneously, we saw how a few physical ships halting in a 2-mile-wide strait in West Asia can instantly threaten the agricultural fertilizer supply, shut down the kitchens of 8 million restaurant workers, and dictate the value of a currency.
It is a striking juxtaposition.
Consider this. As the world races to build these massive, energy-intensive AI data centers to power our digital future, the electricity required to run them is staggering. Are we building the most advanced technological architecture in human history, only to realize its foundational energy needs are entirely dependent on an incredibly fragile, physically vulnerable, analog supply chain of crude oil and cargo ships? What happens when the insatiable energy demands of the AI revolution collide head-on with the geopolitically fractured energy grid? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking those hard questions, stay curious, and continue navigating the noise with clarity. We will catch you on the next one.